The market was alive with noise, the kind that wrapped around you and made it hard to think. Voices rose in uneven tones, some sharp with impatience, others sweet with persuasion. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted across the stone courtyard, mixed with the dry dust of the roads where horses had passed just minutes before. Everything about the day should have felt ordinary, but for her, it wasn't. Her eyes locked on him, and nothing else existed. He wasn't like the others. No one needed to point him out. Even in the chaos of the crowd, he stood out as if the air around him was different, charged with something you couldn't name but could definitely feel. His hair was untamed, his clothes rough and torn in places. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was his eyes. There was no mistaking the fire in them, wild, untamed, daring anyone to try and cage him. Some muttered about him, shaking their heads with pity or distaste. "Too dangerous," one man whispered. Another scoffed, "He won't last long." People laughed at the thought of anyone daring to take him, let alone tame him. Yet she didn't flinch. While the others saw trouble, she saw strength. While the crowd stepped back, she stepped forward. Her voice cut through the noise, stronger than she expected it to be. "I'll buy him myself." The courtyard fell silent for a moment. It was the kind of silence that carried more weight than the loudest shout. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, some filled with disbelief, others with scorn. Yet she stood tall, her chin lifted, as if daring anyone to challenge her decision. They called him wild. They said he was broken, a lost cause, nothing but a risk. But she saw something else, something no one else dared to admit. In his eyes she saw a flicker of power, raw and unshaped, like a storm waiting to be unleashed. And maybe, just maybe, she was the only one who could see it. The crowd began to murmur again. "She's mad. She doesn't know what she's doing. It will ruin her." Their words pressed against her like heavy stones, but she didn't falter. The pull was too strong. Every instinct screamed that this choice, reckless as it seemed, was the right one. He didn't speak. He didn't beg. He didn't even lower his gaze. He stood there, arms bound, body tense, staring back at her, with eyes that refused to break. For the first time, something in him shifted, barely noticeable, a flicker of surprise, as though he hadn't expected anyone to step forward for him. Especially not her. The auctioneer's voice rang out, almost amused. "You'll buy him yourself?" He leaned forward as if daring her to repeat it. "Yes," she said, louder this time. "Myself." The corners of the man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite disbelief. The crowd leaned closer, hungry for what would happen next. To them, it was entertainment. To her, it was everything. She could feel the path of her life shifting under her feet, carrying her somewhere unknown, somewhere dangerous. Coins clinked, hands exchanged, and the moment sealed itself like ink pressed into paper. She had claimed him, though no one could yet tell who had truly won, the buyer or the bought. But power has a way of unsettling the ground it touches. It never comes quietly, and it never stays under control for long. The story was only just beginning, and neither of them knew how much it would demand, or how far it would take them. His eyes met hers one last time before the guards released him. A storm churned in them, rage, pride, and something else she couldn't name yet. The world around her seemed to fade as those eyes burned into her, whispering of promises and dangers. She thought she had chosen him. But deep inside, a quiet voice warned her. Perhaps he had chosen her first, and that thought, unsettling, dangerous, and thrilling, was the beginning of everything. The coins were still warm in her palm when she realized the crowd wasn't going to let this moment pass quietly. Their voices had returned, sharper now, cutting at her with curiosity and judgment. People leaned in to whisper to each other, their eyes darting between her and the man who had just been unchained. It wasn't simply shock anymore, it was fascination. They wanted to see how long before this decision broke her. She forced herself not to look away from him. Every instinct told her that if she showed hesitation, the crowd would eat her alive. He stood taller now, his wrists raw where the rope had rubbed, but he didn't rub them or flex his hands. He just stared. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment, for someone foolish enough to step forward. His silence pressed against her louder than the murmurs of the market. She wondered what his story was, though part of her feared knowing. No one ended up here without reason, and his eyes carried too many shadows to be simple. They called him wild, dangerous, unpredictable, but that wasn't all. There was something more hidden under the surface, and that was what had pulled her in. That was what no one else seemed to notice. The auctioneer's grin widened as though he had just been handed a performance worth watching. He gestured toward her with a dramatic sweep of his hand. "He's yours now. Best of luck. You'll need it." The crowd laughed at that, but she didn't. She tightened her grip on the coin pouch at her side, feeling the weight of her choice settling deeper. He didn't move when they shoved him toward her. He resisted just enough to make it clear he wasn't following because of the guard's push. His steps were deliberate, controlled, as though every muscle in his body was calculating the risk of each movement. When he finally stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the raw energy radiating off him, she almost forgot to breathe. The guard looked at her, half smirking. "He's your problem now." Then he stepped back into the crowd, eager to watch the outcome from a safer distance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The market noises faded into a dull blur around them. She felt her pulse in her throat, steady but heavy. He looked at her as though testing, searching, waiting for her to show weakness. His silence was a shield, but his eyes, those unrelenting, sharp eyes, betrayed a storm she couldn't ignore. Finally, she forced herself to break it. "You'll come with me." He didn't answer. He tilted his head just slightly, the faintest gesture of amusement or perhaps warning. She wasn't sure. But he didn't resist when she turned and began walking. His steps followed, unhurried, like a predator who wasn't bound but simply curious enough to trail behind. The street outside the market was quieter, though the echoes of gossip trailed them like shadows. People peeked from doorways, murmuring as they passed. She held her head high, though inside, questions clawed at her. Who was he really? Why had no one else dared to take him? And why did she, against all reason, feel drawn to protect what others feared? Her small home wasn't far. She led him through winding alleys, the stone walls closing them into shadows where the sun barely reached. His presence made the space feel smaller, heavier, like the air itself bent around him. She could sense the way he watched everything, the cracked shutters, the stray dogs, the broken cobblestones. Nothing escaped his attention. When they finally reached her door, she paused, hand on the latch. This was the line. Once she opened it, he would step inside her world and nothing would be the same. For the first time since she had spoken out. In the market, she hesitated. "You can stay here," she said, her voice quieter now. "For now." He stepped inside without a word, moving like someone who had never been welcomed anywhere but refused to show uncertainty. She closed the door behind them, and the sound echoed too loud in the stillness. The room was simple, just a wooden table, a small bed, shelves with worn books and dried herbs. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She wondered what it looked like through his eyes. Did he see safety, or just another cage? He sat without asking, lowering himself to the corner by the window. His posture was relaxed, but she sensed the control behind it. He was watching her again, unblinking, as though trying to measure her worth, to decide if she was truly different from the others who had called him wild. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough, like stone dragged across the ground. "Why?" The single word held more weight than any lecture. She swallowed, feeling her throat dry. Because they don't see what I see. His lips curved, not into a smile but something close to it. A dangerous kind of curiosity flickered in his eyes, sharper now that he had spoken. And what do you think you see? Her chest tightened. She had asked herself the same question since the moment she locked eyes with him. Power. That was the first word that came. But it was more than that. It was strength, not the kind built from muscle, but the kind that refused to bow, the kind that could change everything if given the chance. She wasn't sure how to say it aloud, not yet. Something worth saving, she said finally. The silence that followed stretched thin. He leaned back against the wall, studying her like she was more of a puzzle than a rescuer. She wondered if he believed her or if he was already planning how to test her words. Outside, the evening began to settle. The noises of the market faded, replaced by the calls of night birds and the distant sound of horses pulling carts. Inside, the air grew heavier with unspoken things. She moved about the room, pretending to busy herself with setting out bread and water, though her mind never left him. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, calculated to remind her of his presence. When he finally reached for the bread, his fingers brushed hers, and she felt it again, that raw charge, that storm beneath the surface. It wasn't tame, and it wasn't safe. But it was alive, more alive than anything she had felt in years. She lay awake that night, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing from the corner. Questions circled in her mind, refusing to let her rest. Who had he been before this? What had broken him? Or was he never broken at all? Only misunderstood? And why did she feel, with a certainty that made her chest ache, that her life had just been tied to his in ways she couldn't yet see? As the darkness pressed in, she realized she hadn't just bought him. She had invited chaos into her world. And chaos never came without a price. She turned on her side, eyes open, watching the faint outline of him against the wall. He hadn't fallen asleep. His eyes, sharp even in shadow, were still open, still watching. It was only then she understood. He didn't trust her, not yet. Maybe he never would. But there was something else in that gaze, something unspoken. A warning. A promise. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the moment she had declared, "I'll buy him myself," she had stepped into a storm that would swallow everything she thought she knew. The night stretched on, heavy with tension, and by the time dawn painted the sky pale gold, the only certainty she had left was that this was only the beginning. The morning light crept into the room slowly, spilling across the wooden floorboards and brushing against the walls like it wanted to wake everything gently. But there was nothing gentle in the air. She felt it before she even turned her head, the weight of his stare, steady and unblinking. He hadn't closed his eyes once during the night. She shifted on the bed, uneasy. The thought struck her that maybe he didn't need sleep the way most people did. Or maybe he simply didn't allow himself that kind of weakness. Either way, it unsettled her. His presence was a reminder that she had taken on something no one else dared to touch. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice quiet. His reply was simple. No. It wasn't exhaustion that marked his tone, but something else. Vigilance. As if he knew the world was full of enemies, and one careless moment would cost him everything. She wanted to ask more, to break through the stone wall he kept between them. But before she could, a sound outside caught both their attention. Hoofbeats. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Her stomach tightened. Visitors weren't common, and the kind who arrived at dawn rarely brought good news. She moved to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see the street. Two riders, cloaked, their faces hidden, scanning the houses with sharp eyes. They stopped near her door, and one of them dismounted. He had risen to his feet before she could speak. Silent but ready, his entire body tense like a bow drawn tight. It wasn't just readiness, It was anticipation. He looked as though he had been waiting for this, as though danger was the only thing he trusted to be certain. The knock on the door rattled the wood. 3 firm strikes, each echoing through the small room. Her heart raced. She didn't open it right away. The man by the window hers now, at least in name, didn't move closer, but his eyes followed her every step as she approached the door. She could feel his warning without him saying a word. She opened it a crack. The man outside pulled back his hood, revealing a face lined with suspicion. "We're looking for someone," he said. His voice was low but carried authority. "Dangerous man. Escaped during the market yesterday." Her pulse hammered, but she forced her face to stay calm. "I don't know who you mean." "The writers." Eyes narrowed. He studied her, then glanced over her shoulder into the dim room. She felt exposed, as though he could see everything, the man leaning silently in the corner, the storm behind his eyes, the truth she was trying to hide. Before the writer could push further, the one still on horseback called out, impatient, "Leave it. He's not here." The man at her door hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. Then he pulled his hood up and stepped back. Within seconds, the hoofbeats faded down the street, but the tension didn't fade with them. She closed the door, pressing her back against it. He was still watching her, unreadable. "You lied," he said. She nodded, breath unsteady. "I had to." For the first time, his expression shifted, just slightly. Not gratitude, not trust, but something close to acknowledgement. He knew she had chosen a side, even if she didn't understand the cost yet. That was the beginning of the conflict she couldn't escape. She had stepped between him and the world hunting him. And now there was no turning back. As the days passed, whispers reached her in fragments. Talk of raids on the edges of town. People vanishing in the night. Officials searching for someone. Dangerous. Someone untamed. Someone who had left a trail of broken chains and unanswered questions. Each rumor twisted tighter around her, and every time she glanced at him, she knew the truth was closer than she wanted to admit. Yet, he never explained. He never gave her the story behind the fire in his eyes. Instead, he watched. He listened. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he scanned the horizon as though measuring how far he could go if he had to. And she, caught in the storm of her own choice, found herself living between fear and fascination. She should have felt regret, but instead she felt something harder to name. There were moments when his silence broke in strange ways. At the market, when a group of men blocked her path, mocking her for her wild purchase, he stepped forward with such quiet authority that not one of them dared touch her. He didn't say a word, but the way his eyes bore into them was enough to send them scattering. Later she asked him, "Why did you do that?" His answer was blunt, "Because you are mine." The words struck her, sharper than she expected. She told herself he didn't mean them as possession, but as recognition of the bond neither of them had asked for. Still, she couldn't shake the weight of them. The nights grew heavier. Sometimes, when she woke, she would hear him murmuring, in a language she didn't recognize, his tone low and harsh, like memories clawing their way to the surface. Other times, he would vanish before dawn and return hours later, his clothes dusted with dirt and his hands raw. He never explained where he went. One night, unable to hold back, she asked, "What are you running from?" He turned his head slowly, eyes catching the dim candlelight. "Not running, waiting." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it carried weight. He wasn't hiding, he was biding time, watching, preparing. And whatever he was preparing for, it wasn't small. The conflict deepened not just in him but around her. Friends who once visited stopped coming. Neighbors began to whisper louder, some even crossing the street when she passed. The price of her choice was spreading, marking her as much as it marked him. And still, she couldn't let go. One evening, while gathering water from the well, an old woman approached her, eyes sharp, despite her frail frame. "You've taken him in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you even know what you've done?" She swallowed. "I know enough," the woman shook her head. "No, you don't. He carries storms behind him. Wherever he goes, walls fall, and those who stand too close are swept away." The words clung to her long after the woman shuffled away. That night, when she looked across the room at him, sitting silent and still, she wondered if she was already too close, already marked by the storm he carried. But it was too late to turn back. The bond was sealed the moment she had declared him hers. Now, with every passing day, she felt the world tightening around them, the threat drawing closer, and deep down, she feared what would happen when the storm finally broke loose. The air in the town grew heavier with every passing day. Rumors of soldiers searching door to door reached her ears more often, and each whisper seemed to tighten the net around them. By now, she no longer wondered if they were looking for him. She knew. Every knock on a neighbor's door, every unfamiliar face in the market, every pause of footsteps behind her on the street made her heart race. And yet, inside her small home, the silence between them deepened. He spoke little, but his presence had begun to fill every corner of the space. When he did speak, his words cut like blades, sharp and brief, always leaving her with more questions than answers. She found herself watching him the way others watched. Storms rolling over the horizon, afraid but unable to look away. One night, as the fire crackled low, she gathered the courage to press him. "They're hunting you," she whispered. "Why? What did you do?" His gaze lifted from the flames, and for a moment she thought he might finally tell her. But instead, he said, "What they fear isn't what I've done. It's what I might do." The words chilled her more than any confession could have. She lay awake after, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering what kind of man carries that kind of warning inside his voice. The tension outside was mirrored by the unease within. Neighbors had grown colder. Children who once laughed when she passed now clung to their mother's skirts, staring at her door with wide, nervous eyes. She overheard one man mutter, "She's sheltering him. She'd bring ruin to us all." But still, she didn't send him away. She told herself it was because she saw something others didn't, because she couldn't abandon someone who had been cast aside as less than human. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. His presence had become a part of her days, his silence as familiar as the ticking of time. Without it, her world would feel unbearably empty. The storm, however, was closing in. One evening, the hoofbeats returned, louder this time. Dozens, not two. Soldiers poured into the square, their torches flickering against the dark sky. From her window, she watched them dismount, their armor clinking as they spread out like a dark tide. The air smelled of smoke and iron. The crowd gathered quickly, drawn by fear and curiosity. Her hands trembled as she let the curtain fall. He was already standing, shoulders squared, gaze locked on the door. For the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes, not the quiet fire she had come to know, but the first spark of the storm the old woman had warned her about. "They're here for you," she said, though the words were barely audible. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved toward the window, watching the soldiers form their circle, their leader barking orders. Finally, he turned to her. "You should leave." Her chest tightened. "And let them take you?" His stare bore into her. "If you stay, you'll be pulled into it. This is not your fight." But she knew it was too late for that. The moment she had declared him hers in the marketplace, she had stepped into his shadow. She shook her head, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. "I'm not leaving." For the first time, his expression cracked. A flicker of something, anger or perhaps sorrow, crossed his face. He turned away sharply, fists tightening at his sides. Then you'll see what they fear. The torches outside grew brighter as the soldiers fanned out across the square. The leader's voice boomed through the night. Hand him over, and no harm will come to the rest of you. The crowd murmured, torn between fear and fascination. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming fast. He stood in the center of the room, every line of his body alive with tension. It was no longer a question of if the storm would break, but when and as the first torchlight spilled through the cracks in her shutters, she realized the climax was no longer far away. The world outside demanded blood, demanded chains, demanded submission. But the man she had chosen, the man with eyes like untamed fire, wasn't built to bow. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would erupt out. The torches outside flickered like restless stars, and the soldier's boots struck the ground in rhythm, a drumbeat of inevitability. She stood pressed against the wall, the pounding of her heart louder than the clamor outside. He moved closer to the door, his shoulders squared, his presence commanding even in silence. She realized then what the soldiers already knew. They weren't here for just any fugitive. They were here because he was a storm that couldn't be caged, a force that could unmake the fragile order they clung to. The leader called again, voice sharp and heavy with threat. Surrender him now. For a breath, time seemed to hold. She thought he would step outside, face them head on, and unleash the fury he had carried all along. But instead, he turned toward her, his gaze steady, unflinching. In those burning eyes, she saw the truth at last. He hadn't been waiting for escape. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment the world would force him to choose who he truly was. They'll never stop, she whispered. No, he said, but neither will I. Then the storm broke. When the soldiers crashed through the door, the air shifted. What followed was not chaos but something sharper, a force moving with precision. He met them not as a cornered man, but as someone stepping into the destiny they had tried to chain. His strength was not only in his fists or his movements, it was in the way he refused to yield, in the way his presence bent the fear of the room toward him. She had expected blood, ruin, destruction. But instead, what unfolded was something else: power without cruelty, defiance without surrender. He fought not to destroy, but to break free. The soldiers, armed with steel and fire, faltered against the weight of his will, and she stood there, unable to look away, the truth ringing in her chest. This was what she had seen in his eyes from the beginning. Not madness, not danger, but the raw, unshaped force of someone who could not be contained. By the time the last torch lay dim on the ground and the soldiers scattered, the square was silent. The crowd, once loud with judgment, now stood frozen. Their fear turned to awe. No one dared to step forward. No one dared to speak. They had witnessed something they would not forget. He turned back to her, chest rising and falling, the fire in his eyes still burning but calmer now, like a storm that had passed and left the air cleaner. She thought he might leave then, vanish into the night, carrying his storm with him. But instead, he stood still, waiting. You should go, she said softly, though the words broke her heart even as she spoke them. If you stay, they'll keep coming. His gaze lingered on her, searching. And for the first time, she saw the wall between them lower. Not completely, but enough to reveal something human beneath the wildness, something vulnerable, something real. They'll come for you too, he said. She shook her head. Let them. I knew what I was choosing. The silence stretched, heavy, with all the things neither of them could say. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice low, carrying the weight of both warning and gratitude. You gave me more than freedom. You gave me reason. And with that, he turned and walked into the night. His figure blended with the shadows until he was gone, leaving only the faint echo of his presence behind. She stood at her door long after, the square around her hushed, the townsfolk retreating into their homes. Alone in the stillness, she let the truth settle in her chest. She hadn't bought him. She had never owned him. What she had done was far greater. She had seen him. She had believed when no one else dared. And maybe that belief was what had changed everything. In the days that followed, the whispers grew. Some spoke of him as a danger, a wild force too dangerous to live. Others, though, told the story differently. They spoke of a man who stood against chains, of a woman who saw strength where others saw ruin. The tale spread beyond the marketplace, beyond the town, until it became something larger than the two of them. For her, life did not return to what it had been. The soldier searched less often, but the memory of that night lingered in every look, every whisper, yet she carried no regret. She had stood at the heart of the storm and had not turned away. Sometimes, when the wind rose through the narrow streets, she swore she could feel it, the same energy she had felt when his eyes first locked with hers. It reminded her that he was still out there, untamed, alive, carrying forward the fire she had chosen to believe in. Her story and his were no longer the same path, but they would always be bound by that one choice, that one declaration that changed everything. I'll buy him myself. And though the world still called him wild, she would always remember the truth. She had looked into his eyes and seen power. She had seen the storm. And she had known, before anyone else, that storms aren't meant to be caged. They're meant to change the sky. That truth was enough to make her stand tall, even when shadows crept close. That truth was the gift he left her. And in the quiet of her home, with the echoes of fire and whispers fading, she carried it with her, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is believe in the power no one else dares to see.